all for joining us. My name is Justin Williams. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions here at Wayne State University Law School. I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of online Q&A sessions we'll be hosting throughout the semester for all of you who are interested in law school as a next step in your professional and personal lives. This session is titled Unpacked, the Law School Application Process. Now, we'll spend the evening chatting about the law school application process in a broad context. Also, we'll answer some questions that you all have submitted to us prior to this broadcast this evening. I'll save a little time at the end because I'm sure that through this process, questions will come up for you all. But again, I do want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll be getting started shortly here. On your screen, you will see a slideshow pop up in just a second. If you follow along with that, you'll have access to all of the content that we have prepared this evening. And we'll go ahead and get things started there. So let's get our PowerPoint up here. All right, so we've already done the introductions. So we'll just move right into content. Big picture questions. So the law school application process in a broad context. What are law schools looking for? So typically, when you go through the law school application process and you submit all of your materials to the law schools of your choice, now they're trying to assess three really big picture questions. The first question is assessing your academic ability and performance to get a better assessment of how you might fit in at that law school academically. If you're prepared to come in and compete with the kinds of students they typically admit based on their academic profiles and past history, and also to a certain extent, the likelihood for your ability to succeed on the bar exam in the state where you'll attend law school. So how do we answer that question in this process? I'm sure many of you probably know, based on the time you spend on Reddit, the kinds of factors that law schools typically take into consideration to make that assessment. A primary factor is your performance on the law school admission test. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another factor is your undergraduate academic performance, sort of in the form of your GPA. So it's about the number, but it's also about what that number means and what it tells us about your ability to compete. So it is, again, that fixed number, the actual GPA, but it also takes into consideration trends in your performance, the rigor of the institution you've chosen, the rigor of the program you moved through, and any trends in your performance. So maybe you had a challenging first semester, but you trended upward, or maybe you had a dip somewhere in the middle of your academic career and recovered. Right. So really getting a better understanding of who you are as a student based on that performance in undergrad. Also, letters of recommendation can play an informative role in that process. So if you're a recent graduate from undergrad, having at least one letter of recommendation from a faculty member who's had you in their classroom will be preferred by many law schools because in many cases, the folks who are helping support the admissions professionals at the law schools you've chosen are faculty members. So they'll want some perspective from their professional colleagues about how you are as a student in the classroom. So once we've sort of tackled that first question about your academic ability and performance, then we move to the second question, which really asks more about your personality, your accomplishments, character, and fit, right? So really taking a big picture evaluation of how you might fit in with the law school you've chosen. So how do we get there? How do we make that assessment as to what you bring to the table besides that academic ability and performance? So a core piece there is the personal statement, your resume that helps us better understand the experiences you've had outside the classroom. To a lesser extent, right, your letters of recommendation, right? So if you've got professional letters of recommendation or personal letters of recommendation for folks who are willing to make a strong case for your fitness for law school study, those can be used in the process to help us make that assessment. And then any sort of addenda that you provide to the law schools you've chosen that provide contextual information about things that may be curious in the process. So if you answer in the affirmative to a school's character and fitness questions, an addenda that explains what happened, what the outcome was, right? That can be important. If you have what would be considered red flags in your academic profile. So if you did have a challenging year in undergrad or a challenging semester, something that provides contextual information about why that happened would be helpful. Or maybe you're somebody whose academic profile is stronger than their law school admission test score, and you've got a history of outperforming your standardized test scores. Something that helps us better understand that in the process. So an addendum that explains that that's the case for you, that you've typically outpaced that performance. Or on the other hand, if you're someone who tested extremely well, but maybe your undergraduate academic career wasn't the best reflection of your ability, an addendum that would explain that would be another piece that we could use to assess this second question. The last piece, you versus everybody, is when you get a little less control over. So a law school will have its own internal enrollment goals, targets it would like to hit, measures that it uses to evaluate the success of any given particular incoming class. So you're up against that, right, which you don't get a vote in. And then also where you fit in the larger applicant pool. So there is a little bit of competition, right, at this early stage of the process, and that you will be measured against your peers in some cases. And that's not necessarily something that you get a vote in this process. So the law school admissions test, what is it? So here's some basic stuff. For those of you who don't know, you have to register to take the LSAT with the people who administer the test. That is LSAT, the Law School Admissions Council. You can find them at www.lsac.org. There's been a big shift in the exam recently. The digital exam rollout began this July. So for those of you who took it, half of you received it as a written exam, and then half of you received it as a digital exam. Starting with this September's exam, all test takers will be taking the exam on a digital platform. So be ready for that change in the process. Additionally, the LSAT writing portion has been separated from the exam itself. So you'll have a year from the date that you take the exam itself to submit that writing sample. I do want to emphasize that it's very important that you submit that sample timely, because not doing so could delay the release of your scores to the law schools to which you apply. So it's really important that you adhere to those timelines and that you get that writing sample complete in a timely manner. So the third piece, your LSAT score and your undergraduate performance are used reliably to predict first-year law student outcomes. Many of you are probably wondering about the GRE. There are law schools that are interested in taking it at this point, but most law schools prefer the LSAT because there is that high level of reliability. There's not as much data out there about the GRE and how reliable it is as a predictor, but we've got reams of data about the reliability of the LSAT score in undergraduate performance in terms of predicting your outcomes in that first year. Wait a minute. So the digital piece, right? That's a big deal. So if you do have questions about it or if you're unsure, LSAC has provided some resources for you. Familiar.lsac.org is a website you can go to get familiar with the actual interface, what it looks like, how you'll interact with it, how you'll use it. I had an opportunity to sort of play around with that at a recent conference, and it is a wonderful, wonderful change. I think many of you will be happy about the change to digital. Of course, there are some drawbacks to that, but all in all, I think there are advantages all the way around. Another resource for you is LSAC's specific website about taking the digital LSAT. You'll see the link there, www.lsac.org/LSAT/taking-LSAT/about-digital-LSAT. So If you've got questions about it, that'll be a great resource for you in this process. So more about the LSAT. What is on it? You've got 35-minute sections of multiple choice questions. One of them will be a reading comprehension section. One of them will be a logical reasoning section. And then two of them will be analytical reasoning sections / logic games. 4 of your 5 sections contribute to your score, and your scores range from 120 to 180. Of course, you'll have the writing sample as well. And then you'll have another section that's unscored that will be either that logical reasoning or that reading comprehension. You won't know until you get it. But the 2 analytical reasoning sections, the 1 logical reasoning and the 1 reading comprehension section, you can count on for sure. So how does the scoring work? So LSAT scores, again, the range is from 120 to 180. To provide you some perspective in our previous year's incoming class about what our percentiles look like as a law school, and this is something that you should be able to find for any of the law schools that you're interested in, is the percentile rank of the incoming class. So our 75th percentile, so that highest end of our class, was at a 161 LSAT score. Right there in the middle of the median, it was that 50th percentile is a 158. And then that lower quartile, right, was a 155. So that's the profile of our LSAT scores for our incoming class for 2018. So I often get this question from people who are interested in going to law school and haven't started preparing for the LSAT, or who have taken the LSAT and maybe feel like they need a little bit more preparation. How should they approach it? I think there are lots of different approaches, right? It's not a cookie cutter sort of process. I think there are some really essential questions you have to ask yourself as you're going through this process. So how do you typically study best? Are you somebody who's able to work through problems alone and navigate that process and feel confident in what your outcomes may look like based on your own studying? Do you need to be in a classroom style setting, right, where you're being drilled on the material, where somebody's checking your work, where you're getting that consistent feedback about your progress and your process? Also, your budget, right? That's ultimately going to determine what your options look like. So there is a really important free resource out there that I encourage anybody who's considering the LSAT to think about. It is khanacademy.org. So there are some LSAT preparation resources there on Khan Academy. If you aren't familiar with it, it is a self-teaching site. It's somewhere that you go to take on material and take on challenges to learn about things in more of a self-guided, self-paced sort of way. And LSAC, the folks who administer the LSAT, have worked with Khan Academy to develop this resource specifically because they recognize that preparation for the exam can be costly, and that having a budgeted piece that's available is a good thing. So I would encourage you to at least check that out. There are always your commercial prep services, so Princeton, Review, Kaplan, right? There are also some local smaller places that you may find who can be a resource to you too. But again, it is about figuring out first what's the best approach for you, and then what's your budget, and then trying to build out a program and a process that works best for you. Can't say this enough. You have to practice. And by practice, you have to take practice exams. LSAC produces some of the old exams that they've used in the past and disclosed. So you can access those through LSAC specifically. There'll be a bundle of what they call prep tests that you can access and buy to really drill yourself in testing conditions. Often, or at least in some cases, I'll talk to people whose first time taking an LSAT is the first time they take the LSAT. And it shouldn't work that way, right? You should take practice exams as a part of your preparation process. One, because it allows you to work through some of those test day jitters and really figure out if the timing that you've been working on is efficient, right? If you're actually hitting the mark. And so you'll have that opportunity to see where you stand, get a diagnostic of your scores and what your performance might be, so that there are fewer surprises when you get your score back. All right, so now let's talk about the application itself and building a law school application. So what's contained in that typical law school application? The first piece is the actual application itself. So this entire process happens online. Eons and moons ago, you used to physically send paper applications to the institutions you chose, but those days are far behind us. I think, to everyone's benefit, that process is administered through LSAC. So you'll do that process online and fill out the application for the individual schools that you apply to. There is no universal law school application. Every law school has their own. So you may want to visit a law school's website to be connected to their application via LSAC. There'll also need to be that personal statement, a resume, your letters of recommendation, the addenda that we talked about if they apply to you, and then your JD Credential Assembly Service Report, which will include your LSAT score, your undergraduate GPA, and transcripts. The Credential Assembly Service is sort of an add-on service that's offered by LSAC. And what that does is it compiles all of your information in one place and then affords you the opportunity to have that report sent to the schools of your interest. So you'll pay a fee for that Credential Assembly Service and then a fee to have it sent to the schools that you choose so that they'll have access to your LSAT score and your undergraduate GPA and transcripts. So going back to this academic ability and performance question. So the pieces that we'll need are those transcripts from all your post-secondary academic institutions. That'll include your undergraduate experiences, any graduate experiences, study abroad, community college, etc. So anywhere that you went post-high school, those transcripts need to be requested and sent to LSAC. All of the LSAT scores are reported to the law schools to which you apply. So all of your scores will show up in that report and we'll have access to them. The Credential Assembly Service puts it all together into a single document that provides that data to us about you as a student, including sort of a master GPA that includes only your undergraduate grades. I'm almost certain there's somebody in this room with a question about how graduate performance factors into that GPA. I can assure you that it does not. So that's not a number that will ultimately influence the GPA that's used to render an admissions decision. So I would consider graduate level school performance is good information to have, but not necessarily dispositive of a law school's likelihood to admit you as a student in its incoming class. So as we talked about, that graduate and professional school GPA is not included, but it can be considered. All right, so again, to that second question, the personality, accomplishments, character, and fit piece. So everybody's got questions about the personal statement because nobody really feels like they know how to do it right? And that's not an unusual thing. So if you have questions about the personal statement, I can assure you that you are not alone. It's so important that we'll be doing a similar Q&A like this one, specifically focused on the personal statement. So I would encourage you to join us for that. We'll talk about those dates a little later in this conversation. But what are the nuts and bolts of the personal statement piece? So typically the format is narrative, right? It's you telling your story to the law school admissions committee. In terms of length itself, you're looking at typically 2 pages. If you can get to 2 pages double spaced, I think you've done a pretty good job. Some statements run longer than that because there's more story to tell, but I think 2 pages is probably going to be your sweet spot at most places. Content itself, I would err on the side of honest but positive, right? I think there's a lot of question about how do I talk about the challenges I've faced in my life? How do I talk about the things that have happened to me that may not necessarily be positive? And I think it's about how you make that story positive. What did you gain from that experience? How has that experience or those challenges helped shape and mold you into the person that you are today, or influenced your decision to pursue this as a next step? You can talk about the things that make you diverse and different in a law school personal statement. Some schools will invite you to submit a diversity statement, which is a separate document from your personal statement where you can just talk about that, right? So I would encourage you to understand what any particular law school accepts. We do accept a diversity statement. So if you'd like to submit one of those to Wayne State, we would gladly read it. Typically, those are shorter than your personal statement, about a page or so, but they can be a complementary piece to that personal statement. If the law schools you're applying to don't accept that or don't make it clear if that's something that you can do, you can absolutely weave some of that diversity piece into your personal statement. And I also want to make this clear. The personal statement is also an introduction to your ability as a writer. Like we talked about earlier, law school faculty sit on these committees. And so they're looking at these writing pieces to determine if this is somebody who's going to come in here and be in a position to learn how to write like a lawyer does without a whole lot of buttressing of their writing skills, right? So you want to make the best case for yourself in terms of the structure, the grammar, and all of those important pieces about the writing. I encourage you, once you've got the personal statement written, to share it with people who can make an evaluation on the grammar, the syntax, the spelling, all of these important pieces. If your undergraduate institution has a writing center, they should see this, right? They should provide you feedback on that personal statement and give you some insight as to what you may or may not need to change so that it's clear and concise and a good representation of your ability as a writer. So the resume, chronological in nature, right? Education, your work history, your volunteer experience should show up in reverse chronological order, right? So if you don't have a resume now, this is definitely the time to start putting one together. I think for most people, one page is good enough. You don't have to detail all of the small pieces and things that are related to your work experience. We just want to know what you did and when you did it in most cases. The letters of recommendation piece we've talked about. Most places expect at least 2, and most places will have a ceiling of 4. So you'll anywhere between 2 and 4 letters of recommendation is most likely appropriate. So who do you have write them? Professors or others who can comment on your intellectual abilities and academic performance. I think it's going to have to be professors for us here at Wayne if you graduated in the last 2 years. So you'll need at least one of those letters to come from a professor. And then there's also room for those who have a little bit more experience in their professional careers or who are a little bit further away from undergrad to source letters from employers. So if you are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or more years out, you are more than able to submit letters that are just from employers. You don't have to try to go back and find a professor because your favorite professor may have retired or they may not be teaching anymore. And we recognize that, right? So you are more than welcome to submit letters from those who know you best, including employers, mentors, or anyone who'd like to vouch for your ability to do this. And I want to emphasize another piece here. Letters of recommendation should always have in parentheses before it strong letters, right? What you want is somebody who's going to make a really good case for you. If there's somebody who doesn't know you very well, that shows up in the letters of recommendation. I've seen some that are very short and trite, and it makes it clear to the committee that this person doesn't really know you and that they can't really vouch for your ability because they don't have much to say. So you want to make sure that you're getting strong letters of recommendation from the recommenders you source. And then again, the addenda piece, right? So character and fitness concerns, and then any context about potential red flag areas in your application. So again, we talked about the addenda piece, LSAT, GPA, character and fitness. Character and fitness. So this is something that you'll hear consistently in the process as you go through the law school experience and at this application phase. So every law school application is going to have questions that ask you if certain things have happened in your life. If you have a question about whether or not something needs to be disclosed as a part of the character and fitness process, you should err on the side of disclosure. I think it can be important to take time to reflect and be truthful about what happened and the outcome. And there's also a duty for you to disclose things throughout the application process and throughout law school. So if you do not disclose a thing in the law school application process, you will have to, at some point, put it in there. At the end of this journey is something called the bar exam. And the bars, the state bars, and all of the states that you'll want to apply to take the bar exam have a character and fitness process. And that process will dig into everything in your past. And if there's something that you did not disclose on your law school application, the state bar will ask you, why did you not share that, right? And that could be a barrier or a challenge for you in the process of actually going about the business of becoming a true practicing lawyer. So do disclose that information in the application process. And if something happens to you in law school, make sure you update the law school itself with the outcome and the data on that, because again, this is going to be something that needs to be shared with the state bar, and they'll have questions if the law school is unaware and if it's not in your file. Contact schools directly to inquire if you have a question, right? If you think it makes sense, or if you don't think, you should reach out. Don't rely on your gut and ask questions if you have them. All right, so you've gone through all of this. You're ready to apply. You still want to do this. Gung-ho, full steam ahead. Now what? So let's talk about timing and some of these details, right? Most law schools have applications that open in the fall, the calendar year before you plan to enter. So let's say you want to start in the fall of 2020. You would start the application process this fall. Most, if not all, schools have a rolling admissions process. So what that means is that they're accepting applications, and as they're accepting applications, they're reviewing applications, and as they're reviewing those applications, they're issuing admissions decisions. So it's really important for you to be thoughtful about the process and to plan ahead. Be strategic in your approach and thoughtful about how you manage this part of the process. So as far as the rolling admissions piece goes, you want to confirm with each school that you're applying to their admissions deadlines. Those do exist, and you have to adhere to them. So this is another piece about thoughtful planning. Again, like we talked about, most applications will open in the fall. You want to confirm with the schools that you're thinking about applying to what those dates may be. Many schools have something called a priority scholarship deadline. That's the date by which you have to have your material submitted to receive fullest consideration for scholarship dollars, which I know all of you are absolutely interested in. So you want to make sure that you have your application showing is complete with the law school you choose by those priority scholarship deadlines, so you get all of the dollars that you are worth in this process and the fullest consideration available to you as an incoming student. So when a decision happens, right, it typically falls into one of three buckets. Either you're admitted straight away, you get a lovely phone call or email that says, hey, welcome to XYZ's law school's incoming class, and you're off to the races, right? You've got the good news and you're ready to roll. In some cases, the answer is no, right? Sometimes you get a deny and you can be invited to apply that next year. Some schools have a reconsideration process. We don't have that here at Wayne. So just be thoughtful about that piece and make sure that you know what a law school will and will not do with the students that it initially denies. In some cases, you will receive a waitlist decision. Again, you Redditors probably know all about the waitlist process, or at least think you have an idea of what that means and the criteria by which one may land on that. And typically what the waitlist decision means is that we like you, but we've got to see some other pieces fall into place in this class before we can extend an offer. We need to know more about the applicant pool. We need to know more about the students who we've admitted already and their intentions in terms of enrollment, because we're trying to manage our class size and the number of seats that are available to you in this process. So sometimes that decision is rendered and the wait list can be a wait, right? It's not called a wait list for nothing. Sometimes you can get that wait list decision in March and not hear about your status in the class until the first day that classes start, depending on the institution and what they're trying to navigate. So if you do land yourself on a wait list, it's important to stay in contact with the schools you're serious about attending, who've waitlisted you, submitting statements of continued interest. Just let them know that you're still there and you're still interested, right? I can recall specifically years where we've called folks on the wait list and said, hey, do you want to do this? Because we might have an opportunity for you soon. And the folks who've said yes, in some cases, we've been able to make that offer, right, and get them into class and get them started at the law school of their dreams. So definitely be thoughtful about that part of the process. Also, if you find yourself waitlisted at a place and you no longer want to be there, call them and let them know, right? Clear the way for somebody else to get the opportunity that you're no longer interested in, just as a courtesy, right? I think it's the right thing to do and a good way for you to manage the process and your professional reputation. All right, so I would be remiss if I didn't at least talk to you all a little bit about Wayne Law and why this might be a good place for you. So why Wayne Law? First piece, outstanding education. Our faculty are committed to helping us build the next generation of practice-ready lawyers. You'll hear that a lot, practice-ready, right? And I think what it means, at least from our perspective, is that you'll have the ability to write like lawyers write. You'll have some exposure to the work that lawyers do through your experiential learning requirements here. So either participation in an externship or in our legal clinics that you'll hear a little bit more about in just a second, but really helping build lawyers who are ready to go out and hit the ground running. We've been named the best value law school for 5 years in a row now. So what that means is that the return on investment is pretty high here. So, when you look at the big picture, job placement, when you look at bar success, when you look at cost of your education and what you'll actually pay, all of those things come together to make us a really good value on the dollar. In terms of cost for our 2018-2019 academic year, the year that most recently passed, looking at roughly $33,000 in terms of tuition. But we also award $7 million in scholarships each year. So we are offering that sort of scholarship program because we know the cost of a legal education is high, and we want to make sure that we're rewarding those who come to us with very strong merit profiles. There's also flexibility, right? We offer full-time day, part-time evening, and combined day-evening programs. So if you're a working mom and you have to stay on the clock, right, you aren't in a position where you can take the time off to do this, you can come to us in a part-time evening, right? If you're just a working person in general or a working parent in general, that part-time program may work for you. If you work, but you've got some flexibility, maybe it's the combined day-evening program. If you want to go hard charging the traditional route, you can go full-time in the day program. We also get questions about dual degrees. What options are out there? What can I do? How do I get 2 degrees if I want to study something different? So we do have some options for you. Criminal justice is one of the options, an MBA, so you can do the JD MBA as a part of this process as well. There's dispute resolution, economics, history, and political science. So you'll get the value of 2 degrees in 4 years as opposed to 5 or 6, depending on the second degree you choose. And so there's some value there for you in that part of the process. There's also practical training. So we talked a little bit earlier about being practice ready. So you'll get some exposure to our clinical externship and internship programs. So our clinics are pretty broad, right? There's our asylum and immigration law clinic, our business and community law clinic, appeal and post-conviction advocacy clinic, our disability law clinic, our legal advocacy for people with cancer clinic, and patent procurement. So sort of broad spectrum of areas of practice where you can get that clinical experience. Again, a robust externship and internship program and opportunity. So if you're interested in those things, Wayne could be a good place to call home. Lastly, location, right? We're right here in the heart of Midtown Detroit. If you are a native Detroiter, you know that there are lots of amazing things happening in the city that you should be a part of. And being here in Detroit is definitely a boon for our business. Students who want to be in this area, who want to practice law in the state of Michigan, find this place to be home, right? And we're near some of the top law firms, courthouses, Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, and government agencies. So you're near where it's happening if you're here in Midtown Detroit. So I will move to the Q&A portion of the evening. That does conclude the piece of this process that's focused on just that slide deck. So let's go ahead and move to Q&A. All right, so we've got a lot of questions here Uh, if you start in so I'll start with the ones that are in our chat box here. All right. So this is all right. So if we're getting a letter of recommendation from someone we worked with, does it need to have a company letterhead? Not necessarily. I think it's a good touch if it does, right? It's definitely helpful if we see it comes from an official source. So if you've been out of school for some time and not in contact with previous professors, can you provide recommendation from employers? Like we talked about, absolutely. You're more than free to provide those as your letters of recommendation. How many students are accepted to Wayne State's law school every year? The answer is it varies. So for this year's incoming class, we've got a class size of 125 people. But the number of people that you admit and the number of people who matriculate is often different. So the number of people we admit can vacillate year by year. I think that what you really should focus on is in the size of the class. And so this year's class is 125 people. I presume we'll be around that number again next year. So be looking for that. So another question, how interested is law school admissions in STEM majors? The answer is we love them. There is a lot of demand in practice for people who have those hard science backgrounds, specifically in the patent space, because your skill set is different. Your knowledge base is a little different than some of the other major programs that we see in the law school application process. So you will ultimately be more than welcome to apply from that background. We've got a question from Stephanie who's asking, if you start in the combined program, can you switch your schedule throughout the years? The answer is maybe, right? I think this is sort of an area where we're trying to figure out what the right approach is. So switching from program to program is something that can be done. I think most students who choose to start one way typically finish that way, unless something changes in their life, right? So let's say theoretically you start off in the evening schedule because you're working and you find yourself in a position where that's no longer necessary. And you say, okay, yeah, I want to start doing this full time all year round. Well, yeah, I think it's something that we can consider doing, is switching you to a full-time schedule. Let's say you start off full-time and you're saying, all right, no, I need a job and I got to go to an evening schedule. I think it's something that we could consider. It's really more of a case-by-case scenario, right? It's not necessarily a switch that gets flipped. It is a conversation that's had, because we have to make sure that we're doing right by you as a student. So another question here is about the professor-to-student ratio. I'm going to be very candid off the top of my head. I don't know what that number is. It's one that we'll have to research and get back to you about. So please make sure that we have your email address and your contact info so that we can follow up with you with the answer to that question. Another question here is about, when is the recommended time to apply? So like we talked about, the applications typically open in the fall. I say that the recommended time to apply is before that priority scholarship deadline at the institutions you choose. For us here at Wayne, that deadline typically falls in mid-March. So you're looking at around March 15th as the date when you would want to have that application material into the law school. So I'm going to run through a few of the questions that you all submitted here before the program too, because there were some good ones here. So let's look at this first one. So what do the obstacles that people who have a little bit of work experience, what obstacles do they face in this process? And I think that's a really great question, right? So if you have a career, right, if you've been a professional and been working before this experience, I think there are advantages, right, to how law schools may view you in the process. There's an expectation that you'll bring a sort of a professional nature to the classroom setting and a set of experiences and background that may be different. I think the challenge is really getting back in the saddle, as it were, academically, right? So if you've been out of the classroom for a while, really getting your sea legs under you and figuring out how to do the law school thing again. And the application process itself, I don't think there is really a disadvantage. I think it's really just about putting together the most compelling case for yourself, because you'll still be evaluated amongst your peers, right? So it's really about making that best case for yourself and telling that story. So we've also got questions about the LSAT score ranges. We talked a little bit about that. Specifically, the ranges that we have for ourselves. So for 2018, you saw what our sort of strata were, right? At the top end of that, we're in the 160s. At the median, we're in the high 150s. So for this year's class, a 159 was the median. I don't have our 75th percentile and our lower quartile yet, but again, that was our median. So the closer you are to that number, the stronger the case you have for being accepted here. In terms of GPA, so we get that question too. Our median GPA was a 3.56. So the closer you are to that number, again, the better the case that you can make for yourself. So while going through the application process, what stands out in a particular application more so than others? I think every applicant is unique, and that's the part that makes these kinds of questions hard. And I get these kinds of questions relatively often, right? How do I stand out in the process? How do I make myself different than my peers? And the answer to that is that you already are, right? You are by definition different from your peers. And so you're in a position to make that case just by telling your story, because nobody else's story is exactly yours. So making sure that you're making that best case for yourself and presenting yourself as well as humanly possible. So let's jump back to some of the questions I've got here in my chat. What type of law would be conducive to someone with a background in the field of psychology? The answer is whatever law, whatever practice area you choose. It's sort of a meme in the practice community that the practice area you don't necessarily choose the practice area, it chooses you, right? Many people find something they're passionate about in law school, and they work really hard to find opportunities related to that, or they seek out experiences that will affirm that their interest in that area is true. So I don't think you need to worry about whether or not there's a field that is best suited for psychology, and be open to all of the options that are out there for you. Another question here, which is a great question. How long does it take to receive a decision once you've submitted your application to Wayne Law? So typically, right, at the peak of our season, I would say probably 6 to 8 weeks. If we are really, working and churning through these things, it can be 4 to 6. But I think I would caution anybody to be looking at about 6 to 8 weeks. So opinion on transferring from a lower ranked law school to Wayne Law. Sure, I think you can, right? I think the question is whether or not you should. That's a much tougher question, and one that if you want to talk about it in a little bit more detail, I would encourage you to schedule some time to chat with somebody in our office. So Gabrielle wants to know, does the ABA limit how many hours law students may work if a full-time student? So this is one that's interesting, right? Because for a while the ABA did mandate that. They did say you could work no more than 20 hours. But very quietly, they eliminated that requirement. So it is no longer an ABA rule that you can only work 20 hours. I think institutions typically will encourage their students to not work 20 hours and also be a full-time, not work more than 20 hours and also be a full-time student. One, specifically in your first year, right? There's a lot that you don't know about what this experience is going to be like, what to expect, and what's going to happen, right? And so typically we would encourage you as an institution to think about working 20 hours or less. So if one is denied admission, would it still be possible to retake the LSAT and resubmit the app in the same cycle? I think that for us, we typically don't do reconsideration, but that is the one scenario, right, in which it's probably a really good idea to ask, right? If you improve significantly on the LSAT during the time that you submitted an application and you've been denied, I think you would be remiss if you didn't at least ask, right, what your options are, because that's just something else that lets the admissions committee know that maybe you are ready for this, right? Maybe you're in a position where you can come in and be successful. So I think that's probably going to be true of most places, is that if you've got a higher LSAT score, then it's at least worth having the conversation. Stephanie wants to know, what is the peak season? I would say we are at our busiest in January, February, and March. I think we sort of hit a little bit of a lull in April and May. And then we get sort of another bump, right, late in the process from later applicants in June who are sort of tardy to the party, right, but still want to be considered for admission. So I would say we're at the busiest probably in the earliest part of the year. So how does Wayne Law view having 2 LSAT scores on file? We view it like having 2 LSAT scores on file. So what that means is that we'll look at both scores and then try to decide, and not even try to decide, we'll make the decision based on the highest one, right? But if there's trends in that performance, we'll at least have a conversation and say, hey, look, this is somebody who's on an upward trajectory, which is a good thing. Or we'll say, hey, look, this is somebody who's trending downward in a really significant way. So we need to be thoughtful about this decision to try to make a choice about whether or not this is somebody who's going to come in here and be successful. And so we've got a question here that says, if your LSAT score was not as high as you wanted, but still a decent score, should you address that in your addenda? I think if your LSAT score hits a specific law school's median, I don't think you necessarily need to address that with an addenda. If you feel obligated or that it's necessary to do so, you're free to do that. But we don't necessarily need to see why your score hit our median, right? We're just going to presume that's a number that you're comfortable with because you submitted it to us and you're ready to roll. All right, so let me go back here to some of the questions that we had before. So is a law school not in the top 100 worth going to? Sure. I think that there are a lot of really good law schools out there that are not necessarily ones that are at the top of the list in terms of ranking. I think you have to go through this process and give a lot of thought to what's important to you, what matters, right? Is this school outside of the top 100, but in a city and a place that you love, right? What's the alumni network for that law school like in the place that you want to practice? Are you likely to find some opportunities there? Where do you fit in that school's profile, right? If it's a school that's at the lower end of the ranking spectrum, but somewhere where you could go in and be in that top 10% and increase your likelihood for getting some really good job opportunities, great. But I'd also encourage you all to look at the required ABA disclosures for any law school that you're choosing. So there's consumer information that's produced by every law school that lets you know all of the hard data. So what their admissions data is, what their job placement data is, what their bar success data is. And I would really encourage you all to check that stuff out. So you should look ABA standard disclosures. You can go to the search box at any law school and type that in, and you should be directed to a link that provides that information to you. So I would encourage you to think about it that way. If this school is somewhere you really want to be, you need to know what you're getting into. And that's true of a school that's in the top 100 and a school that's totally unranked. All right, so regarding STEM majors, how many were admitted into the incoming class, and is their GPA given some leverage? I don't think that we've necessarily spliced our data that way in terms of students with hard science majors and whether or not they were admitted. But what I will say is that we recognize that for many students, those programs are challenging, right? They're tougher. So an engineering major or a biology or a biochemistry major, they may have taken some tougher courses, right? And so there is some attention given to the rigor of those programs. And it's just like we talked about, that undergraduate performance. The question is, what does the number mean, right? What does that number tell us about somebody's ability to come here and do the work? And the rigor of the institution and the rigor of the program matter. So in some ways, right, it's not necessarily an advantage in the process, but it is an acknowledgement that these programs are tougher and more challenging. So yes, there is some thought given to that in the process. So I've got another question here that's talking about the focusing on the experience they faced as a minority that opened up a creative side, and then how you should focus on that stuff in your personal statement. And it's just like we talked about. I think it really is about what that's done for you, right? What that part of your story means to who you are now. What's the value add, right? Why does this matter to this law school admissions process? Why is this important to you as a future practicing attorney, right? So really figure out how to tell that story and really make it compelling and also positive. Does Wayne Law offer housing options? Yes, there is on-campus housing available. Most of our students tend to live in the area and not necessarily on campus. So if that's something that you're thinking about, it's definitely a conversation we can have. But just as a general rule, our students do typically find themselves off campus and away from the law school itself. So which component of the application is weighed the highest? I love this question because what people are really trying to figure out is if they can compensate one piece for the other. And I think that what you'll find is that the order that I presented the questions in that law schools are trying to answer should give you a little bit of insight, right, into how those things may be valued or weighted. I think the most important question that law schools have to answer is whether or not you can come in and be successful academically. I think that's a threshold question for most law schools. So I think more weight is given to that academic performance and that GPA. And then the second part of the question is really, what we want to figure out about you as it relates to how you'll be and how you'll navigate and what you'll bring to the table as a person, right? And so I think the first question is whether or not we're confident you can do the work, and that LSAT and that GPA are really the core pieces there. But I think that second question is also very important. There are folks who are great academically who we may or may not want in our classroom, right? Who we may or may not want in the law school based on what we see in the rest of the application. And so that can lead to some really interesting conversations in an admissions committee meeting, right? But, it's about making sure we're being as holistic and whole person conscious as we can in this process. And I think that's going to be true for a lot of law schools. So at least in terms of the start and end dates for the academic year, January 6, 2019 is the start date for the winter semester, meaning classes start. I don't know what the end date is, but I think it's sometime in April. April 13th, 2020 is the end date for the academic calendar for the winter semester. And typically that's going to be true across the board, right? Early January is when classes start. Mid-April is when they'll end for a winter semester. For a fall semester, you should expect a late August start. And then classes will end sometime mid-December, right? So you'll have some time to get through. You'll have some time to get through that part of the process, get through final exams, and get you home for the holidays. So I think those are all the questions we have for now. Looks like we just got another one. Awesome. So what is considered when determining who receives scholarships and how much it is offered? Any advice for advocating for yourself in this space? So many, if not most, law schools are sort of are tiering their aid based on merit, right? So that's really about that first question, right? Your performance in undergrad, your GPA, and your performance on the LSAT. And so those things are often the primary factors in determining merit aid. Some institutions have need-based aid. We don't do that here, but that will take your financial need into consideration and build out a package for you based on that. And so you should really think about those factors. I mean, the best advocacy you can do for yourself is to be the best student you can and to do the best on the LSAT you can. So there's really not a whole lot of advocating outside of that, right? That would typically be invited because law schools want to be able to make that decision. And they typically make that decision once, right? And that they make the best offer at the time that they make the admissions decision. And that's the offer that you'll have in terms of scholarship aid. For 1L, you can only start in the fall or also winter. The answer is for Wayne, we only do start in the fall. There is no winter start. Any other questions that I can answer? Any other ways that I can be helpful to you all? Please do pop those questions into the chat because I'd like to get as many of them answered as we can. And we'll give it a few minutes here to see if we can get another question or two answered. So there's a question that I've got here that I do want to touch on. Now, so if I graduate in December 2020, when should I start applying to law school and taking the LSAT? And then can I recommend any private law school scholarships? So I'm going to answer that second question first. There isn't a lot of scholarship aid out there in the private sector or in a private capacity for law school. So most of it comes from the schools themselves in terms of merit aid on the front end. I would encourage you to do your Googles, right, in terms of private law school scholarship dollars. Law schools don't always keep track of that information, right? But if there is something out there, I think Google would be your friend in helping you find out that decision. If you graduate in December 2020, I think, and you're thinking about the application date and the timeline, I think is about when you want to start, right? If you don't graduate until December 2020, you won't be able to start law school until the fall of 2021. So you could reasonably start that application process in your last semester. So let's say you graduate in December 2020, you could start your applications in September and October to be ready for admission in fall 2021. In terms of timeline for taking the LSAT, most students take it the summer before they start applying. So that would mean that you would need to take it probably by the summer of 2020, so that you'll have your score back and can compile the rest of your materials to be ready to apply that fall. All right, so again, gonna give you all another minute or two to pop other questions in here before we wrap this thing up. And if I don't get any questions here in just a minute, we'll return to our slide deck and talk a little bit about a few other things I want you all to think about as we move forward here. All right, so let's go back to our slide deck and look at some information here. So some upcoming events, on-campus things. So if you want to learn more about Wayne Law specifically, I encourage you to join us for one of our information sessions and personal statement workshops. We'll have one here in the building on Thursday, October 24th from 6 to 8, November 18th from 6 to 8. And then for those of you who are in the LSAT prep process, we'll do a mock LSAT here with JD Advising on Saturday, November 2nd. That'll run from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. It'll be digital, so make sure you bring your laptop. But it's a really good opportunity to see where you stand in your preparation process and really get your feet under you in terms of preparing for the LSAT. In terms of other online Q&A sessions, we will host at least three more of those this semester. So we'll do one that's called Application Toolkit for First Generation Law Students. We'll host that Wednesday, October 9th from 6 to 7:30. Do's, don'ts, and how-tos for the personal statement. That'll be on Thursday, November 14th from 6 to 7:30. And then do's, don'ts, and how-tos, the application process roundtable. We'll host that on November 21st from 6 to 7:30. I would encourage you all to join us for those, as there'll be a really good opportunity to learn more about the law school application process and hear from some experts in this space as well. We're also here as a resource to you all as you go through this process. You'll see all of our staff here on the screen. Our Dean of Admissions, Kathy Fox, is fantastic. My colleague, Jill Burnett Maurice, a 2017 Wayne Law grad. So she's got some firsthand knowledge for you. Ashley Strasser, who's a recruiter and 2019 Wayne Law grad, and our wonderful student ambassadors who we couldn't do our work without are all great resources to you. If you have specific Wayne Law questions, phone numbers there on the screen at 313-577-3937. So if you want to schedule some time to visit us or just call and ask questions, you can do that. Email address, if you want to email questions, is lawinquire@wayne.edu. All right, so I'm going to pop back in here and see if there are any other questions. All right, looks like we've got one more question here. So if I've not taken the LSAT but would like to enter law school next fall, is this considered too late? I think the answer there is no, right? You still have opportunity to take the LSAT multiple times this fall and even once or twice in the winter, right? That could be eligible for, put you in a position to have your materials in before that priority scholarship deadline. The only barrier after that scholarship deadline is that you have to understand that we'll accept your application, but that you won't get that fullest consideration for scholarship aid. So if that's something that's important to you, you'd have to get it in before that March 15th deadline, which leaves you the November LSAT, the January LSAT, and even maybe the February LSAT, depending on when the scores come out. So you got a few bites at the apple where you still be in a position to be competitive for admission for fall 2020. All right, again, we'll give it another minute or two here to generate some more questions. And if not, we'll wrap things up and call it a wonderful evening. So one last call for questions here. All right. Doesn't look like we've got any new questions coming. Again, if you do have questions, please do give us a call or send us an email. We love to answer questions and to encourage people to come visit us. But I do want to end the evening by thanking you all for joining us and inviting you to visit our events page and register for our upcoming Q&A sessions. And we look forward to seeing you all in this application process. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening. And we'll see you next time.